I woke up to the sound of bulldozers tearing up my family's farmland without warning or permission. The Oakridge Estates HOA had boldly decided to build their new bus stop on my property, completely ignoring boundaries that had stood for 3 generations. What they never bothered to check was that I've spent the last 15 years as the county's senior zoning inspector. How far would they go to defend their illegal construction once they realized their career-ending mistake? I still remember my grandfather's hands, calloused and weathered, as he showed me how to work this land. Our 40-acre farm has been in my family since 1937, when he built our homestead with nothing but determination and his own 2 hands. 3 generations of my family have tilled this soil, raised livestock, and maintained our independence. Every morning for the past 20 years, I've followed the same routine. Up at 5 a.m. to feed the animals and check the fences before heading to my job at the county offices. But last Tuesday was different. I was in the barn when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of heavy machinery where it didn't belong. I rushed outside to find a small bulldozer tearing up my driveway entrance. 2 construction workers in yellow vests were marking boundaries while another was unloading lumber from a truck. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, barely containing my rage. The foreman barely looked up from his clipboard. "HOA project. Bus stop construction." "This is private property," I said. "My property." He smirked and handed me a document with Oakridge Estates HOA letterhead. "All approved. Right here." I scanned the paper, my blood pressure rising with each line. "This doesn't give you permission to build on my land." "Look, we're just following orders," he shrugged. "Take it up with the HOA." I stood my ground. "Not happening. Pack up and leave now, or I'm calling the sheriff." The workers exchanged glances, clearly not expecting resistance. After a heated phone call with their supervisor, they reluctantly packed up, for now. But as they left, the foreman warned, "We'll be back tomorrow with proper authorization. This is happening whether you like it or not." It was a small victory, but I knew the battle had just begun. I spent the rest of the day leaving messages for the HOA president that went unanswered. I reviewed the property lines on my deed and researched local ordinances, preparing for what I knew would come next. What I wasn't prepared for was what happened the following morning. At 7:15 a.m., I walked out onto my porch with my coffee to find parents' SUVs parked on my hayfield and a cluster of school children gathered at the end of my driveway. A bright yellow school bus was pulling up, its stop sign extending as children lined up where the construction had started the day before. I couldn't believe my eyes. There was no bus stop. They hadn't built anything yet, but somehow word had spread that this was now an official pickup location. "Excuse me," I called out, walking toward the group. "This is private property. There's no bus stop here." A mother in designer yoga pants looked me up and down with disdain. The HOA sent an email. "This is the new bus stop location." "No, ma'am, it's not. This is my driveway, and nobody has permission to be here." Children stared wide-eyed as parents pulled them closer. Another parent stepped forward. "Look, we're just following instructions. The old stop was too far from our homes." The bus driver seemed confused. "I was just told to add this stop to my route starting today." I was trying to remain calm when I noticed water seeping up through the ground where SUVs had parked. They'd crushed part of my irrigation system, causing what would likely be thousands in damages. After the bus left, I walked the property line and found small survey markers that hadn't been there the day before. Someone had moved onto my land overnight, marking boundaries that cut 10 feet into my property. Back at the house, I pulled out the HOA document the foreman had shown me. Reading it carefully, I discovered the smoking gun. They had classified my driveway as community common area, despite it being clearly marked as private property on all county records. This wasn't just trespassing. This was a calculated land grab. I'd had run-ins with the Oakridge Estates HOA before. When they first developed the subdivision adjacent to my farm 5 years ago, they'd sent me violation notices about my tractor being visible from the road and claimed my barn needed to be repainted to community standards. I'd ignored them, of course, my property wasn't part of their jurisdiction. But this was different. This was direct encroachment. I decided to do some digging into the HOA itself. My county position gave me access to records most people couldn't easily obtain. What I found was troubling. Oakridge Estates had a history of aggressive expansion. They'd previously attempted to annex 3 other adjacent properties through what their minutes euphemistically called boundary normalization. 2 elderly homeowners had sold under pressure, unable to fight the legal threats. The third had held out until they passed away, after which their children quickly sold to a developer connected to the HOA board. The HOA president, Richard Kessler, had a particularly interesting background. Before leading the Homeowners Association, he'd been a real estate developer whose company went bankrupt after the housing crisis. Now he was using the HOA as his personal fiefdom. That evening, I got a call from my neighbor Earl, whose farm bordered mine on the south side. They pulled the same thing with me last year, he said. Tried to claim my pond was causing drainage issues for their golf course. Sent me cease and desist letters for months. How'd you handle it? I asked. Lawyer cost me nearly 15 grand, but I kept my pond. You watch yourself, Tom. These folks play dirty. By the time I finished my research, I had identified at least 7 other property owners who'd experienced similar invasions. Some had fought and won, others had given in. But something about this bus stop felt different, more calculated, more aggressive. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone who'd been bullied by people who thought their money and connections put them above the law. The relief of knowing I wasn't alone in this fight gave me strength for what was coming next. The next day around noon, a sleek black SUV pulled into my driveway. A woman in a tailored business suit stepped out, clutching a leather portfolio. She looked exactly like someone the HOA would send, polished, professional, and completely out of place on a working farm. I was fixing a fence post when she approached, her heels sinking into the soft ground with each step. Mr. Johnson? She called out with a practiced smile. I'm Melissa Vaughn, Community Relations Director for Oakridge Estates. I wiped my hands on my overalls and nodded. I know why you're here. She glanced at the area near my driveway entrance where children had gathered that morning. Several were there now too, waiting for the afternoon bus, despite there being no actual structure yet. I wanted to personally address your concerns about the new community bus shelter, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. The safety of our children must come first. Don't you agree? It was a clever tactic, framing anyone who opposed them as being against child safety. My concern is with people building on my property without permission, I replied evenly. She flipped open her portfolio. There seems to be some confusion about property lines. According to our records, the area in question falls within community-maintained easement. That's interesting, I said, pulling out my phone. You don't mind if I record this conversation, do you? For clarity's sake. A flicker of unease crossed her face, but she nodded. Of course not. I hit record. Please explain again why you believe you can build on my property. As I was saying, the HOA has documentation showing this area as part of our community easement. The bus shelter project was approved by unanimous board vote after several safety incidents at the previous stop. What safety incidents? She hesitated. There were concerns about visibility and traffic. Documented concerns? Reports filed with the sheriff or county. I'm not personally familiar with the specifics, she admitted. I pointed to my property marker. That stake has been there for decades. Your survey flags are 10 feet inside my property line. Mr. Johnson, I understand your frustration, but this is about something bigger than property lines. It's about community. I nodded encouragingly, letting her continue as my phone recorded every word. The HOA is prepared to take certain actions if homeowners obstruct community improvements, she continued, her tone hardening. This includes fines, liens, and if necessary, legal proceedings. But I'm not a member of your HOA, I pointed out. Your property falls under our expanded jurisdiction as of the county approval last year. That was a blatant lie, and now I had it on record. What county approval would that be? I asked innocently. She checked her notes and cited a file number. Thank you, I said. That's very helpful. She seemed to mistake my calm for capitulation. So you'll cooperate with the construction schedule? We'd like to resume tomorrow. I'll be reviewing all the documentation and responding appropriately, I said carefully. As she turned to leave, she delivered her parting shot. Mr. Johnson, fighting the HOA rarely ends well for individual homeowners. We have resources you can't imagine. I watched her SUV disappear down my driveway, satisfied with how much she had just revealed without realizing it. The file number she'd referenced didn't exist in county records. Her admission that they were forcing this through without proper approvals. Her thinly veiled threats. All of it would prove useful very soon. That evening, I found a notice taped to my mailbox. Emergency HOA meeting. Tomorrow 7 p.m. Bus shelter obstruction. The next evening, I walked into the Oakridge Estates Community Center wearing my cleanest pair of jeans and a button-down shirt. The room was packed with about 60 residents, most of whom turned to stare as I entered. Richard Kessler, the HOA president, was at the podium. He was a portly man in his 60s with an expensive haircut and a country club tan. Mr. Johnson has decided to join us, he announced, as if I was late to a meeting I'd never been invited to attend until finding a notice on my mailbox. I took a seat in the back row and observed. As you all know, Kessler continued, we've encountered an obstacle in our efforts to provide safe transportation access for our children. He clicked a remote, and a PowerPoint slide showed my driveway entrance. The bus shelter location was selected after extensive safety studies. Another click showed children waiting dangerously close to the road at the old location. Unfortunately, he said with a dramatic sigh, Mr. Johnson has decided his personal interests outweigh the safety of our community's children. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd. I remained silent. For the next 20 minutes, Kessler laid out their case. Increased traffic made the old stop dangerous. My location was optimal for access. The HOA had attempted to work with me but encountered unreasonable resistance. Then came the lies. That my property was subject to an easement from a 1980s county road project. That I had initially agreed to the bus stop but changed my mind. That I had threatened workers. I took notes of each false claim, each misrepresentation. Every word was another nail in their legal coffin. Finally, Kessler opened the floor for comments. Several parents stood to express concerns about their children's safety. One father directly called me an obstructionist who didn't care about children. Then an elderly woman in the third row raised her hand. I'd like to say something. Kessler acknowledged her reluctantly. Yes, Mrs. Abernathy? She stood slowly, leaning on her cane. I've lived here for 30 years, long before Oakridge was built. Tom Johnson's family has farmed that land for generations. If he says it's his property, I believe him. And I remember when this board tried to force the Wilsons to remove their gorgeous oak tree because it violated some ridiculous height restriction. We're becoming bullies, and I don't like it. A few people applauded cautiously. I nodded my thanks to Mrs. Abernathy. Kessler quickly regained control. While we appreciate diverse opinions, the board has thoroughly reviewed this matter. We'll be proceeding with construction as planned, with county officials present to ensure compliance. As the meeting adjourned, I slipped out quietly, but not before overhearing two board members discussing getting the zoning guy to sign off on permits retroactively. Little did they know, the zoning guy had heard every word. Back home, I spread county maps and property records across my kitchen table. Using my access to the county database, I pulled the actual records for both my property and the Oakridge development. The documentation was crystal clear. There was no easement on my property, no expanded jurisdiction for the HOA, and certainly no county approval for their bus stop project. I dug deeper into the bus shelter proposal itself. The construction contract had been awarded to Pinnacle Builders LLC for $75,000, an absurd amount for what was essentially a glorified shed. A quick business entity search revealed that Pinnacle Builders was owned by James Kessler, the HOA president's brother. The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't about child safety. It was about funneling HOA funds to a family business. But why my property specifically? I overlaid the transportation department's road planning maps with the HOA development plans. The truth emerged. If they built the bus stop on HOA property, they would be required to widen the road and install a proper turnout, at a cost of over $200,000. By claiming my land, they avoided that expense. I also discovered that the board had recently increased HOA fees by 15%, citing the bus shelter as a primary justification. Property owners were literally paying for the Kessler brothers to enrich themselves. More disturbing still, I found similar patterns in 3 other HOA projects over the past 2 years, all awarded to companies connected to board members, all at inflated prices. As the county's senior zoning inspector, I knew exactly which regulations they had violated. Building without proper permits, falsifying property boundaries, misrepresentation in official filings, violation of conflict of interest provisions for HOA contracts, unauthorized use of private property. I carefully documented each violation, creating a comprehensive case file while maintaining my anonymity. The satisfaction of building an airtight case against them kept me working well past midnight. By morning, I had everything I needed, except the perfect moment to reveal who I really was. 2 days later, I was splitting firewood when another vehicle pulled into my driveway, this time a black luxury sedan. Richard Kessler himself stepped out, along with a silver-haired man carrying a briefcase. "Mr. Johnson," Kessler called out with forced joviality. "Got a minute to chat?" I set down my axe and wiped my forehead. "What can I do for you?" "This is Stanley Weiss, our association's attorney," Kessler said. "We thought it was time to clear up this little misunderstanding person to person." Weiss extended his hand. "Mr. Johnson, I understand you have concerns about the community improvement project." "You mean the unauthorized construction on my property?" I replied, not taking his hand. His smile tightened. "May we sit down somewhere? This won't take long." I led them to my porch, where they declined my offer of iced tea. Weiss opened his briefcase and removed a document. "Mr. Johnson, we've prepared a limited easement agreement that should address your concerns while allowing this important safety project to proceed." I glanced at the paper. It was a legal document granting the HOA permanent access to a 15-foot section of my property, far more than needed for a simple bus shelter. "In exchange," Weiss continued, "the HOA is prepared to offer you a one-time payment of $2,500. The insult was staggering. My land was worth at least $50,000 per acre. "That's not going to work for me," I said calmly. Kessler's friendly facade cracked. "Look, Johnson, we're trying to be reasonable here. That shelter is going up one way or another." "Is that a threat?" I asked. Weiss interjected smoothly. "What Mr. Kessler means is that we have multiple legal pathways available. Should you decline our generous offer, we would be forced to pursue other options." "Such as?" "Well," he said, straightening his tie, "the county can exercise eminent domain for public safety improvements. We have excellent relationships with the commissioners. Additionally, we could pursue claims regarding your agricultural activities creating nuisances for residential neighbors. The fertilizer runoff, livestock odors, early morning equipment operation." "So you're threatening to file false claims if I don't sign over my property?" "I'm merely outlining potential areas of legal exposure," Weiss replied coolly. "Defending against such claims would be costly regardless of their merit." Kessler jumped in. "We need your signature today, Johnson. Construction resumes tomorrow morning with or without it." "And if I refuse?" "Then prepare for consequences," Kessler snapped. "The HOA has never lost a legal battle against a homeowner, and we're not about to start with some stubborn farmer." I examined the document again, appearing to consider it. "Let me think about it overnight." "No," Kessler said flatly. "Now or never. This offer expires when we leave." I set the paper down. "Then I guess it expires." Weiss handed me his business card. "Reconsider, Mr. Johnson. Call me when you're ready to be reasonable." As they walked back to their car, Kessler turned. "We'll see you bright and early tomorrow." I'd advise staying out of the workers' way. I watched them drive off, then went inside to make a few important phone calls. Their ultimatum had just made my job much easier. True to their word, construction workers arrived at 7 a.m. the next day. I watched from my porch as they set up equipment, careful not to directly confront them. This time, I noticed a county vehicle parked nearby, someone from the permits department, no doubt there to provide retroactive approval. That evening was the scheduled board meeting where they planned to finalize the bus stop project. According to the source inside the HOA who had been feeding me information, they had arranged for several county officials to attend and rubber stamp their actions. The community center was even more crowded than before. At the front of the room, Richard Kessler stood with Melissa Vaughn and Stanley Weiss. 3 people in county government uniforms sat at a side table, looking uncomfortable. I recognized 2 of them, Dave from Roads and Janet from Public Works. The third was Ron Simmons, a junior inspector from my own department. They had specifically avoided inviting me, the senior inspector, no doubt hoping for an easier approval process with Ron. Kessler opened the meeting with a smug announcement. I'm pleased to report that the community safety project is back on track. County officials are here to address any technical questions, but they've reviewed our plans and found them fully compliant with all regulations. This was a blatant lie. No such review had been completed. Melissa stepped forward with a PowerPoint presentation titled, Overcoming Obstacles to Community Safety. The first slide showed my farm with an unflattering photo of my weathered barn. As you know, we've encountered resistance from this property owner, she began, pointing to my land. Despite our best efforts at reasonable negotiation, he has refused to acknowledge the community's needs. For the next 15 minutes, she painted me as an unreasonable, selfish holdout endangering children's lives. She showed mock-ups of the proposed shelter, a structure far larger and more elaborate than a simple bus stop. It looked more like a small building, with a footprint that would extend well onto my property. Then came the planted questions from HOA-friendly attendees. Isn't there a safety issue with farm equipment operating near children? Doesn't the county have the authority to override one person for public good? How soon can construction be completed if this obstruction is removed? Finally, Stanley Weiss stood to explain the legal framework for proceeding despite my objections. He threw around terms like implied easement and public access doctrine, legal gibberish designed to sound legitimate to lay people. In conclusion, Kessler said, we'll be completing this project expeditiously with county cooperation. Mr. Johnson has been invited to this meeting but has apparently chosen not to attend. That was my cue. I stood up from my seat in the back row. Actually, I'm right here, I said clearly. Heads turned. Kessler's smile faltered slightly. Well, he recovered. Perhaps you'd like to say a few words before we proceed with the county approval? I walked slowly to the front of the room, nodding to people I recognized along the way. Ron Simmons, the junior inspector, looked particularly uncomfortable as I approached. I reached the podium and turned to face the crowd. Good evening, everyone. My name is Thomas Johnson. Many of you know me as the owner of Johnson Family Farm. What you might not know is that for the past 15 years, I've also served as the senior zoning inspector for this county. The silence was absolute. Kessler's face drained of color. Melissa Vaughn's mouth opened slightly. Stanley Weiss frantically began shuffling through his papers. In my official capacity, I continued calmly, I've reviewed the proposed bus shelter project in detail. I'd like to share my findings with you all. I placed my official county identification on the podium where everyone could see it. The proposed construction violates county ordinance in 7 specific ways. I began listing them methodically, watching Kessler's face grow increasingly pale with each point. First, no construction permit was ever filed. Second, the property boundary was falsely represented in submitted documents. Third, no environmental impact study was conducted despite proximity to agricultural land. Fourth, Stanley Weiss attempted to interrupt. Mr. Johnson, this is hardly the appropriate forum. I'm not finished, Mr. Weiss, I said firmly. As the authorized county representative, I have the floor. I continued through my list of violations, then moved to the documents I had discovered. Additionally, the contract awarded to Pinnacle Builders LLC represents a clear conflict of interest, as the company is owned by James Kessler, brother of the HOA president. The $75,000 allocated for this project exceeds standard costs by approximately 300%. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. One of the county officials, Janet from Public Works, was taking notes with an alarmed expression. I held up the easement document they had tried to pressure me into signing. This so-called limited easement would have granted permanent access to portions of my property far exceeding what would be needed for a bus shelter. It's my professional opinion that this project was designed not for child safety, but to circumvent the $200,000 cost of required road improvements had it been built on HOA property. Kessler finally found his voice. These are baseless accusations. You're clearly in a conflict of interest yourself, using your position to protect your land. That's why I've already submitted all documentation to the County Ethics Board and recused myself from any official decisions regarding this matter, I replied. The county commissioners have been fully briefed and have authorized me to issue an immediate cease and desist order for all construction activities. I held up the official document with the county seal. As of this moment, this project is suspended pending full investigation. The room erupted. Homeowners were shouting questions at Kessler and the board members. Stanley Weiss was frantically whispering to Kessler, who looked like he might pass out. "This is preposterous," Melissa finally exclaimed. "The board has all necessary approvals." Ron Simmons, the junior inspector, stood up. "Actually, Ms. Vaughn, no approvals were ever issued by the zoning department. I was invited here tonight to consult, not to approve anything. And I would never have approved construction on private property without proper documentation." Janet from Public Works added, "We've received no official plans or permit requests for this project." Nothing. The HOA board members looked at each other in panic. They hadn't expected county officials to contradict them publicly. An older gentleman in the front row stood up. "I was treasurer last year before being voted out for questioning contracts. Are you saying our fees went to overpaying the president's brother?" Before Kessler could respond, another homeowner called out, "How much have we spent on this already? And on legal fees to threaten this man?" added another. Mrs. Abernathy, the elderly woman who had spoken up for me before, used her cane to point at Kessler. "I told you all something wasn't right. Didn't I say it?" I held up my hands for quiet. "I understand everyone has questions. An official investigation will determine if any laws were broken beyond the zoning violations I've identified. In the meantime, I've prepared a fact sheet about this situation that you're welcome to take." I placed a stack of documents on the table, copies of the evidence I'd gathered, with key points highlighted for easy reading. Homeowners rushed forward to grab them, while the board members huddled with their attorney in panicked consultation. Stanley Weiss finally approached me. "Mr. Johnson, perhaps we can discuss this privately and come to some arrangement. All communications should go through the county attorney's office now," I replied. "I'm sure they'll be in touch." As I walked toward the exit, homeowners stopped me with handshakes and apologetic comments. "We had no idea," was the common refrain. Outside in the parking lot, Richard Kessler caught up to me, his face flushed with anger. "You set us up," he hissed. "You could have identified yourself from the beginning." "You tried to steal my land," I replied calmly. "You could have approached me honestly from the beginning." "This isn't over," he threatened. "Actually, Mr. Kessler, it is," said a voice behind us. We turned to see Sheriff Martinez, who had arrived as I requested. "Mr. Kessler, the county attorney has some questions for you first thing tomorrow." Kessler's shoulders sagged as the reality of his situation finally hit him. The following days brought a whirlwind of activity. The county commissioners held an emergency session to review the case, resulting in an immediate and permanent halt to the bus shelter construction, a formal investigation into the HOA's contracting practices, suspension of the entire HOA board, pending investigation results, referral of potential criminal charges to the District Attorney. Pinnacle Builders LLC had its contractor license suspended pending review, and 3 other projects they had completed for the HOA were flagged for inspection. Stanley Weiss, the attorney, issued a statement distancing himself from the unauthorized actions of certain board members and claiming he had been provided incorrect information. Meanwhile, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Neighbors I'd never met called to thank me. Media outlets wanted interviews about HOA overreach. Other property owners shared similar stories of intimidation and encroachment. Earl, my neighbor who had fought his own battle with the HOA over his pond, brought over a bottle of bourbon. "Damn proud of you," he said as we sat on my porch. "Stood up for all of us." The construction materials left at my property were removed by court order, with the HOA covering all costs for restoring my damaged irrigation system. The official survey confirmed what I already knew. They had deliberately misrepresented property boundaries to claim parts of my land. A week after the confrontation, a convoy of vehicles pulled up to my farm. It was a group of Oakridge homeowners, led by Mrs. Abernathy. "We've formed a committee," she announced. "Going to rewrite the HOA bylaws completely, add ethics provisions, competitive bidding requirements, the works. Would you consider being an advisor? We could use someone who knows the rules." I agreed to help. These weren't my enemies. They were victims of the same corrupt leadership that had targeted my property. The most satisfying moment came when the county transportation department confirmed my suspicions. Had the bus stop been built on HOA property where it belonged, they would have been required to widen the road and install a proper turnout, at a cost of over $200,000. Kessler's scheme to save money by stealing my land had ultimately cost the HOA far more in legal fees, investigations, and reputation damage. 3 weeks after that fateful HOA meeting, the county completed its investigation. The findings were damning. Richard Kessler and 2 other board members were removed permanently from the HOA leadership and faced potential criminal charges for fraud, misappropriation of funds, and falsifying documents. The audit revealed they had diverted over $300,000 in HOA funds to companies connected to board members over the past 3 years. The new interim HOA leadership issued a formal apology to me and other affected property owners. They established a transparent budgeting process and competitive bidding requirements for all future projects. Most significantly, the county commissioners passed what became known locally as the Johnson Ordinance, strengthening protections for agricultural properties against encroachment and creating a streamlined process for reporting HOA overreach. The school district established properly permitted bus stops in appropriate locations with legitimate safety features, none of them on private property. One by one, board members who claimed they had been kept in the dark about Kessler's schemes approached me to apologize personally. Some seemed sincere. Others were clearly trying to avoid being associated with the scandal. James Kessler, the brother who owned the construction company, agreed to reimburse the HOA for the inflated contracts in exchange for avoiding contractor license revocation. What started as a simple defense of my property lines had exposed years of corruption and changed how HOAs throughout the county operated. Local farmers stopped by to thank me for standing up to the developers. One brought a hand-painted sign that read, "No trespassing, zoning inspector lives here," as a joke. I actually put it up. Today, my driveway entrance looks just as it did before this all started, perhaps a bit better, since the HOA had to restore the grading and reseed the damaged areas. The proper bus shelter was built where it should have been all along, on actual HOA property with all the required safety features and permits. Mrs. Abernathy now leads the reformed HOA with transparency and respect for property rights as her guiding principles. They even invited local farmers to their community picnic, something unimaginable under the previous regime. As for me, I still wake up at 5 a.m. to feed the animals before heading to my county job. But now I drive past that proper bus stop with a sense of satisfaction, knowing that standing your ground against bullies can change things for everyone, not just yourself. My grandfather taught me that land isn't just soil and boundaries. It's a trust, a heritage to protect. Sometimes protection means getting your hands dirty with hard work. Other times it means standing up to those who think their money and power put them above the law. The simple truth remains. Even the most powerful neighborhood tyrants will eventually face justice when good people refuse to back down.